My name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old, and I design buildings that stand through earthquakes. I guess that's ironic, because that Christmas morning in Denver, the ground beneath my life cracked wide open, and no amount of structural engineering could hold it together. The smell of cinnamon rolls and pine needles filled my parents' living room, a place that had always looked perfect in photos but never felt warm in real life. It was supposed to be one of those golden holiday mornings, fireplace glowing, soft music playing, snow drifting gently outside. Instead, I was sitting cross-legged on the rug, surrounded by torn wrapping paper, and the sound of my sister Sophie squealing in delight as she held up a set of BMW keys. The metal caught the light of the Christmas tree and threw it across the room like fireworks. I stared at her, then at the window, where a white SUV gleamed in the driveway with a giant red bow on top, just like the commercials. My father beamed with pride, his face glowing brighter than the tree. "You deserve it, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with affection. My mother clasped her hands, eyes shining as though witnessing a miracle. Our little artist finally driving something that matches her talent. Sophie twirled, her laughter high and bright, and for a moment, she looked like a teenager again, instead of a 34-year-old woman who still called Dad for rent money. I waited for my turn, though deep down I already knew. I'd learned long ago that expectations in this family only lead to disappointment. My parents handed me a small box wrapped in red foil paper. It was light, almost hollow. I peeled it open, forcing a smile. Inside sat a ceramic piggy bank, the kind you'd buy in the children's aisle of a discount store. When I tipped it over, 2 crumpled $1 bills slid into my palm. Dad laughed, the kind of laugh people use to fill silence. "It's the start of your future home fund, Em. You've always been so practical, not like some people." He winked at Sophie, who pretended to look offended before giggling again. Mom added, "You're just so good with money, sweetheart. You don't need much." For a second, I couldn't breathe. The words stung more than the cheap gift ever could. You don't need much. That was always the message. I was the stable one, the reliable one, the one they didn't have to worry about. My achievements were expected, not celebrated. My success was invisible because it didn't require saving. I set the piggy bank on the coffee table, its hollow sound echoing in the quiet between their laughter. Sophie hugged Mom and snapped selfies beside her new car keys, her joy filling every inch of space I wasn't allowed to take up. I looked down at the 2 wrinkled dollars in my hand, and a strange calm washed over me. Not sadness, not even anger, just clarity. I finally saw the pattern, the shape of something I'd been living inside without realizing it. It wasn't about the money. It was about worth. Hers was measured in love and luxury. Mine, apparently, was worth $2. I excused myself. My voice sounded foreign, like it belonged to someone else. I climbed the staircase, slow and steady, as if I were walking through years of memories that now made perfect, painful sense. Along the hallway hung the family photos, vacations, birthdays, milestones. Sophie's face smiled from every frame, front and center, while I hovered somewhere on the edge, half cropped, half present. In the upstairs bathroom, I locked the door and leaned over the sink. The mirror reflected a woman who looked calm but felt hollow. My chest ached like something was pressing against my ribs from the inside. I'd imagined this Christmas differently. I'd even wrapped gifts with love, a custom leather portfolio for Dad, a bracelet Mom had admired months ago, a watercolor set for Sophie's art clients. I'd spent weeks saving for those gifts, thinking maybe this year they'd finally see me. But they didn't. They never had. And they never would. That realization was the most freeing and devastating truth I'd ever known. Downstairs, I heard Sophie's laughter again, mingling with Dad's proud voice. "She's finally got something worthy of her talent," he said. And Mom replied, "Our girl's going places." I pressed my hands against the marble counter until my knuckles whitened. I wanted to cry, but no tears came. There was nothing left to cry for. Instead, I started thinking, really thinking, about what life could look like if I simply stopped trying to earn their approval. If I just left. That idea, once unthinkable, now felt like oxygen. The clock on my phone read 1:57 a.m. When I finally stood from the bed hours later, my mind made up. The house was silent except for the hum of the heater and the faint whistle of wind through the eaves. I packed one suitcase, clothes, my laptop, the teddy bear my grandmother had given me before she passed. I slipped on my coat and boots and crept downstairs, careful not to wake anyone. The piggy bank still sat on the coffee table where I'd left it, glinting faintly under the Christmas lights. I placed the two $1 bills beside it, like an offering I no longer needed to make. Then, I walked into the kitchen and laid my house key on the counter next to the coffee maker, the same one Dad programmed to brew at 6 a.m. every morning. It would greet them in a few hours, right before the family breakfast I wouldn't be there for. As I reached for the door, I paused. My reflection shimmered in the glass window of the foyer. Tired, yes, but calm. Ready. Outside, snowflakes were still falling, whispering against the frozen ground. I stepped out into the cold, each crunch of my boots in the snow sounding like a heartbeat. My old Subaru waited at the curb, loyal and unpretentious, everything that BMW wasn't. When the engine started, the clock on the dashboard flipped to 2 a.m. sharp. The headlights carved two white lines through the darkness. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, "This isn't running away. This is finally walking toward myself." Then I drove. Away from Denver. Away from the years of, "You're so strong, you don't need help." Away from the kind of love that measured worth by weakness. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, it felt like mine. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. And if you want to hear more stories like this, true tales about finding courage, setting boundaries, and healing from the families that broke us, please make sure to subscribe. It's what keeps this channel going and helps me share more stories that matter. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Question: if you were in Emily's place on that Christmas morning, what would you have done? A. Stayed and pretended everything was fine to keep the peace. B. Packed your bags and left, even if it meant starting over alone. Comment your answer below, A or B, and tell me why. The hum of the highway filled the car like a steady heartbeat as I drove south, away from the only home I had ever known. With every mile that passed, the white glow of Denver faded behind me, and memory took its place. Memories I had never wanted to examine too closely before, because doing so meant admitting the truth, that what I'd called love had always come with conditions. When I was 8, Sophie got her first dance recital. Mom made cupcakes shaped like tiny ballet slippers and rented a camcorder to record every moment. I remember sitting cross-legged in the front row, clutching a wilting flower I had picked from the yard, watching her twirl under the stage lights. Afterward, everyone took photos of her with her bouquet and shiny costume. No one asked if I wanted to be in the picture too. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't the star that day. I would have many of those quiet justifications over the years, each one chipping a little piece off my heart. By the time we hit middle school, the pattern had already formed. When Sophie wanted art lessons, Dad bought her canvases and easels and drove her to classes every Saturday. When I asked to join a science club, he said we couldn't afford another extracurricular. He called it practicality, but even then, I knew practicality was just a softer word for preference. Still, I worked with what I had. I borrowed books from the library, taught myself equations, and learned to build things out of scraps from the garage. That's how I fell in love with architecture, turning imbalance into structure, chaos into something that could stand. High school brought bigger stages for Sophie and smaller spaces for me. She got a Sweet 16 party in a rented banquet hall with a chocolate fountain and a live band. I got a store-bought cake at the kitchen table. Mom said, "You're more low-key anyway, Em. Big parties aren't your thing." I laughed and nodded because it was easier than disagreeing. That night, while Sophie danced under fairy lights, I sat by the window of my room, watching headlights pass, wondering why wanting to be celebrated felt like selfishness. College was supposed to change everything. I thought hard work would level the playing field. I graduated high school with honors, applied for scholarships, and got accepted into a top architecture program in Chicago. The day I received my acceptance letter, I ran downstairs to show my parents. Mom smiled faintly, but Dad just said, "That's wonderful, honey. Now, how are you planning to pay for it?" I laughed at first, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. 2 months later, they announced they decided to fully fund Sophie's degree in fine arts at a private university because artists need a little help getting started. So I worked. I waited tables, stocked shelves, and spent nights studying in the campus library while Sophie posted pictures from Europe, exploring artistic inspiration on my parents' dime. They called her adventures finding herself. They called my exhaustion responsibility. I learned to smile through it, to act like I didn't notice the imbalance. But I did. Every tuition bill, every care package that arrived for her filled with designer scarves and perfume, while mine contained practical things, laundry detergent, notebooks, socks, reminded me of it. "We just know you'll put these to good use," Mom would say on the phone. Love, in our family, was measured by how fragile you appeared, and I was never fragile enough. The years blurred into a steady rhythm of doing what was expected, graduating early, getting hired, climbing each rung of the professional ladder. My parents mentioned my success to friends, but always as a side note. "Our Emily? She's the practical one," Dad would say. The subtext was clear. Reliability is admirable, but it isn't lovable. I became the invisible glue holding our family together, organizing holidays, sending reminders about birthdays, fixing broken things. Sophie was the sparkle, I was the scaffolding. One got applause, the other was simply assumed. When Grandma died, she left a small inheritance for both of us. It wasn't much, but it was enough to help me finally buy a car, the old Subaru that would later carry me through that snowy night. I learned later that my parents had quietly doubled Sophie's share, claiming she needed help getting back on her feet. I didn't confront them. I didn't want to appear ungrateful. But that night, as I drove home from Grandma's funeral, something inside me shifted. I realized that I had spent most of my life trying to earn what should have been freely given. After I bought my first apartment in Seattle, I invited my parents to visit. I had worked overtime for months to afford that space, small, sunlit, and mine. I cleaned every corner, cooked dinner, and waited for them to arrive. When they finally did, Mom walked through the door, looked around, and said, "It's nice, Em. Cozy. You always were the sensible one." Then she added, "Sophie's new condo is twice this size, but of course she needs the space for her art studio." That one sentence undid me more than years of small slights ever had. I realized it didn't matter how high I climbed. The view from their eyes would always be the same. It's strange how you can live decades inside a narrative without realizing it's been written for you. Mine was simple. Sophie was the dreamer, and I was the doer. She inspired. I maintained. The truth is, I didn't resent her, not entirely. She never asked for the favoritism. But she learned to expect it, just as I learned to survive without it. We both adapted to the script our parents had written, and in doing so, we became strangers performing roles instead of sisters sharing lives. The more I drove, the more I saw the timeline of it all, laid out like the highway stretching before me, mile after mile of quiet compliance. Each memory, another road sign reminding me of who I'd been trained to be, dependable, rational, self-sufficient. I'd mistaken endurance for peace. I thought that being uncomplaining made me good, but good in my family was just another word for invisible. The irony was that my career revolved around balance, load-bearing beams, distribution of weight, harmony between form and function. I understood symmetry in buildings better than I did in relationships. I could calculate stress points in a structure, but I never acknowledged the stress lines in myself. My family had built a house of favoritism, and I had reinforced it with silence. The snow on the mountains outside my window softened as the road descended south. For the first time, I felt the ache behind my ribs begin to ease. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was awareness. The kind that makes you realize your pain has a shape, a history, and a choice. I couldn't rewrite the past, but I could refuse to live by its old blueprints. I thought about the way Mom used to brush Sophie's hair when we were little, gentle and patient, and how she'd hand me the brush afterward saying, "You can do yours yourself, can't you?" I always had. That's what they loved about me. I didn't need tending. But maybe that was exactly what I needed all along. As the Arizona border sign appeared ahead, my headlights washed over the words, "Welcome to Arizona," and I whispered to the empty car, "Welcome to me." Because that's what leaving was, not an escape, but an arrival. I wasn't running from my family. I was stepping out of the shadow of their story and into the light of my own. The clock on my nightstand flickered to 1:58 a.m. when I finally decided to stop pretending I might fall asleep. My room was dark, except for the glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains, slicing faint lines of gold across the walls. The house was silent. No creak of pipes, no hum of voices, no laughter floating from downstairs. Just the thick, suffocating quiet that follows after a storm of realization. It's strange how clarity doesn't always come with thunder or tears. Sometimes it arrives like still water, calm, reflective, certain. That's how it came to me. I slipped out of bed, my heartbeat loud enough that it felt like it might wake the whole house. The carpet was cold against my bare feet as I crossed to the closet. My fingers hesitated over the row of neatly hung clothes, some still tagged from office sales I never attended, others reminders of holidays that had blurred together. I reached for the practical ones: jeans, sweaters, boots. Things that felt like me, not like the version my family expected. I moved slowly, quietly, the way you move when you're leaving something sacred and poisonous at once. The suitcase clicked softly as I opened it on the bed. Inside, I packed the essentials: laptop, documents, toothbrush, the teddy bear Grandma had given me when I was 5. I ran my hand over the faded stitching of its paw and felt a pang of something that might have been grief or maybe relief. Down the hall, the soft rhythm of my parents' breathing echoed from behind their closed door. I wondered what they would say when they woke to find my room empty. Maybe they'd think I'd gone for a drive. Maybe they wouldn't notice right away. They always assumed I was fine. Responsible Emily, dependable Emily. The one who could disappear without causing alarm. In the bathroom, I caught my reflection in the mirror again. My eyes looked different. Tired, yes, but steady. There was a quiet defiance there that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't rage, it was resolve. The kind of calm that only comes when you finally stop asking for what won't be given. I wrote a note, not an apology, just a truth. I need space to breathe. That was all. I placed it on the dresser where Mom would see it, right beside the jewelry box I'd bought her for Mother's Day. She'd never used it. When I crept downstairs, the scent of pine from the Christmas tree still hung in the air, mixed with the faint metallic tang of the tinsel and the sweetness of leftover cider. The room looked almost peaceful now, bathed in the soft glow of the fairy lights. The piggy bank still sat on the coffee table, the same one they'd given me that morning, pink and hollow, mocking and innocent all at once. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I reached down, turned it over, and let the 2 $1 bills fall out again. I smoothed them flat on the glass surface, the sound small but sharp in the silence. $2. 2 decades of being the reliable one. 2 lifetimes of being unseen. I set them beside the piggy bank and whispered, "Keep your investment. I'm cashing out." In the kitchen, I left my house key on the counter, right next to the coffee machine that would begin its pre-programmed brew at sunrise. That felt right, leaving it there among their routines, their certainties, their expectations. When I opened the front door, the winter air hit my face like a baptism. The snow had thickened since evening, blanketing the driveway in a smooth, untouched sheet of white. My breath turned to mist as I stepped out. Every sound felt amplified. The crunch of my boots, the distant hum of a streetlight, the low groan of the old wooden porch. My Subaru waited at the curb, its roof powdered with snow. I brushed off the windshield, my fingers going numb as I worked. The car had been my first real purchase after college. Nothing fancy, just dependable. Like me. But tonight, it didn't feel ordinary. Tonight, it was freedom on 4 worn tires. When I slid into the driver's seat, the cold leather made me shiver. I turned the ignition, and the engine sputtered before catching with a reassuring hum. The clock on the dashboard glowed 2 a.m. exactly. For a moment, I just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house I was about to leave behind. From this angle, it looked beautiful. The soft lights, the garlands in the window, the perfect holiday picture. Anyone passing by would think a happy family slept inside. And maybe they did, at least by their definition of happiness. But I'd finally realized that love without acknowledgement isn't love. It's obligation dressed in comfort. I whispered, "I'm not running away," just to hear the words aloud. "I'm choosing myself." The tires crunched against the snow as I pulled away from the curb. The neighborhood was still, every house dark except for one porch light flickering in the distance. My headlights carved 2 narrow paths through the white leading me forward. I turned on the radio out of habit, but every station was static. I left it that way. The hum filled the car like a companion. At the first stop sign, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to look back just once, but I didn't. I pressed my foot on the gas, and the car surged ahead. As the miles unfolded, the city lights thinned into darkness. Denver fell behind me, shrinking until it was just a cluster of faint orange glows on the horizon. The highway opened wide, stretching south toward the mountains. I rolled down the window slightly, letting the freezing air sting my cheeks. It felt like proof. I was alive, moving, untethered. At a red light on the edge of the city, my phone buzzed against the console. Mom. For a moment, instinct kicked in. I reached for it. Then I stopped. The screen glowed with her name, familiar and heavy, and I let it ring until it went dark again. Seconds later, a text appeared. Did you remember to pay Sophie's studio electric bill before you left? That was it. No, are you safe? No, where are you? Just another reminder of the hierarchy that had defined our lives. Even my leaving couldn't rewrite the pattern. I placed the phone face down and drove through the red light as it turned green. The snow grew heavier as I climbed into the mountain pass. The road curved sharply, the guardrails ghostly in the headlights. I drove slowly, steady hands on the wheel, the wipers beating a rhythmic pulse against the windshield. My thoughts began to quiet, replaced by the sound of the tires on snow and the low hum of the heater struggling to keep up. When I finally pulled into a rest area overlooking the valley, I turned off the engine. The silence was immense. The sky stretched above me, black and infinite, scattered with stars that looked close enough to touch. For a long time, I just sat there, letting the stillness sink into my bones. And then, in that quiet, a thought rose that I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Maybe I wasn't leaving a family. Maybe I was leaving a system that had mistaken endurance for love. Maybe this was what freedom sounded like, the absence of apology. I reached into my bag and pulled out the notebook I'd packed at the last minute. On the first page, I wrote, 2 a.m., left Denver. Then below it, first breath of my own life. The pen trembled in my hand, but my heart was steady. I looked through the windshield one last time toward the faint outline of the highway stretching ahead. Then I whispered into the darkness, let's see who I become. When I started the engine again, the dashboard clock blinked 2:17 a.m. The road waited, quiet and endless, and I drove into it, away from everything familiar, toward everything true. By the time the sun rose over the mountains, I had already crossed into Arizona. The world outside my car was painted in copper and rose, the kind of light that makes everything look temporarily forgiven. The snow had vanished somewhere behind me in Colorado, replaced by desert plains and red rock cliffs that blazed like embers under the morning sky. I hadn't slept since leaving Denver, but I didn't feel tired. It was as if exhaustion had been replaced by a strange, trembling clarity. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and for the first time in years, I didn't know where I was going, and that uncertainty felt like freedom. My phone buzzed occasionally in the console. Missed calls from Mom, texts from Dad, all ignored. Each silence between those vibrations was a tiny act of rebellion. I didn't owe explanations anymore. I was finally off the map they had drawn for me. Somewhere near Sedona, the landscape began to shift. Red stone mesas rising like ancient cathedrals, cacti dotting the roadside like sentinels. My gas tank blinked low, and I turned into a roadside cafe perched at the edge of a small desert town. The neon sign out front flickered, Ruth's Diner, open 24 hours. Inside, the air smelled of bacon grease and coffee. A jukebox in the corner played something slow and haunting, the kind of song you only hear in places that have seen more goodbyes than hellos. I slid into a booth by the window, its vinyl seat cracked but warm from the sun. A waitress appeared with a coffee pot before I could ask. Long night? She asked, pouring the steaming liquid into my cup. You could say that, I replied. My voice sounded foreign, as if it belonged to someone else, a woman between lives. She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't demand conversation, but made it safe to have one. Her name tag read, Ruth. She looked to be in her 60s, silver hair pulled back, her eyes a shade of blue that seemed to hold more stories than time. Heading somewhere or running from somewhere? She asked. I hesitated, then said softly, maybe both. She nodded knowingly, setting a plate of toast in front of me. They're not as different as people think. Sometimes running is just what moving forward looks like. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't cried since leaving Denver, but my throat tightened now. Ruth poured herself a cup and slid into the booth across from me like we'd known each other for years. Families? She guessed. Yeah, I said, if you can call it that. Ruth stirred her coffee slowly. Oh, I can. I've seen it all. The kind that breaks you with their absence and the kind that smothers you with their expectations. Either way, you forget who you are trying to keep them happy. That sentence cut through me with surgical precision. She didn't know my story, yet somehow she did. I told her bits and pieces, not the whole thing, just fragments. The BMW, the $2, the silence that had followed me for years. Ruth listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back and said, Honey, they taught you to measure love in sacrifice. That's not love. That's control with a pretty ribbon on it. She slid a slice of pecan pie toward me. On the house, she said. Eat. It helps when you're deciding who you want to be next. I smiled for the first time since Christmas morning. The pie was warm, sticky, and sweet in a way that made me remember childhood before it became a competition. For a moment, I wasn't the daughter who was never enough. I was just a woman in a small diner, being offered kindness without conditions. After breakfast, I stepped outside. The sun had climbed higher, burning away the chill that had followed me from the mountains. Across the road, a small shop sold turquoise jewelry and handmade notebooks. I went in, drawn by something I couldn't name. The shelves were lined with journals, leather-bound, cloth-covered, filled with blank pages, waiting for someone brave enough to start again. I picked one up, its cover soft and worn, and bought it without hesitation. Back in my car, I opened to the first page and wrote, December 26th. Somewhere near Sedona. I'm not lost. I'm unlearning. The act of writing steadied me. Each word was a small declaration. I existed outside of their story now. My life didn't have to orbit theirs. Before pulling onto the highway, I scrolled through my contacts and stopped at one name, Clara, my old college roommate. We hadn't spoken in months, not for lack of love, but because life had simply taken us in different directions. Clara had always been the kind of friend who understood silence as much as conversation. I hesitated, then pressed call. It rang twice before she answered. Her voice groggy but familiar. Em? It's 2 a.m. Is everything okay? I left, I said simply. There was a pause, then the sound of her shifting in bed. Left as in? As in for good, she exhaled. Where are you? Arizona, somewhere near Sedona. Another pause. Then, softly but firmly, come to San Diego. Stay with me. You can figure things out from here. I wanted to protest, to say I didn't want to burden her, but she cut me off before I could speak. Don't even start. You've spent your whole life being the helper, Em. Let someone help you for once. The tears came then, quiet and unstoppable. Her words cracked open something inside me, something I'd been holding together with logic and denial. Help. Such a simple word, but it felt like oxygen. Okay, I whispered. Text me when you're on the road again, Clara said. I'll make up the guest room. When the call ended, I sat in silence, the phone still warm in my hand. The desert stretched out before me, wide and endless, the air shimmering with heat even in winter. I turned on the ignition, the car rumbling to life again, and looked one last time at Ruth's diner through the rearview mirror. She stood at the window, coffee pot in hand, giving a small wave. I waved back. As I pulled onto the highway, the miles unrolled beneath my tires like a promise. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was escaping something. I was traveling toward myself. Somewhere between Sedona and the California border, I began to hum along to the faint tune on the radio. It was a song I didn't recognize, but it felt like movement, like possibility. The kind of melody you remember long after the words fade. The desert wind swept through the crack in my window, warm and wild. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, smiled through my tears, and whispered into the open air, "Let's begin again." The road to San Diego felt like a bridge between lives. By the time I crossed the state line into California, the landscape had softened from crimson desert into stretches of golden hills and ocean wind. The air smelled different here. Saltier, freer, like possibility. Clara's voice echoed in my head from the call the night before. Come to San Diego. Stay with me. You don't have to do this alone. It had been so long since anyone had said that to me and meant it. When I finally reached her neighborhood, Morning sunlight spilled through the palms, the streets lined with houses painted in cheerful, fading pastels. Clara's home stood at the end of a quiet street near Balboa Park, a white bungalow surrounded by overgrown bougainvillea, the kind of place that looked both lived in and loved. She stood in the doorway waiting, barefoot and holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You made it," she said, her eyes soft with that familiar mix of warmth and concern. I wanted to answer, but my throat closed up. Instead, I nodded, and she wrapped her arms around me. For a long moment, I let myself be held. I didn't realize how long I'd been starving for simple affection. No conditions, no comparisons, no judgment. Just someone saying, "I see you. Stay." Inside, her home was full of life. Plants spilled from windowsills, books stacked in uneven towers, the faint hum of a record player in the corner. It smelled like cinnamon and ocean air. "You can have the guest room," she said, leading me down a narrow hallway. "It's small, but it has good light. I think you'll like it." That night, I slept for 10 hours straight. No nightmares, no anxiety about what I should have done differently. Just sleep, the kind that heals. Over the next few days, I moved through my life like a stranger relearning language. I emailed my supervisor at the architecture firm, explaining that I'd relocated for personal reasons and wanted to transfer to their San Diego office. It was a long shot, but I'd built a solid record in Seattle. 2 days later, I received an email from the regional director. "We'd be lucky to have you here, Emily. Let's make it official." For the first time in a long while, I smiled at my screen. I hadn't needed anyone's approval to make this decision, and yet here was validation earned on my own terms. The San Diego office was smaller, more relaxed, with sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. People greeted me warmly, their curiosity gentle rather than prying. I kept my personal story to myself. I didn't need to explain the empty spaces I came from. I was here to build new ones, strong, balanced, designed to withstand pressure. Clara suggested I start therapy again. "You've been carrying too much for too long," she said one evening over takeout. "It's time to put some of it down." That's how I met Dr. Mara Evans, a therapist whose office smelled faintly of lemon and old paper. She had an easy calm about her, the kind of presence that didn't demand confessions, but made them possible. During our first session, she asked, "When did you first learn that love and approval were the same thing for you?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. She waited patiently, and in the quiet that followed, something inside me began to unravel. Week by week, I started to piece together the architecture of my own past, the load-bearing walls of guilt, the beams of conditional affection, the foundation cracked by favoritism. Mara helped me see that walking away from my family wasn't betrayal, it was survival. She said, "You didn't leave to hurt them, Emily. You left to stop hurting yourself." That sentence stayed with me. Life in San Diego unfolded slowly but beautifully. I found a small apartment downtown. Nothing fancy, but it had hardwood floors that glowed at sunset and a small balcony overlooking the city. I furnished it secondhand, piece by piece, each item chosen intentionally, not inherited or imposed. For the first time, my surroundings reflected me, not someone else's expectations. Clara introduced me to her circle of friends. Writers, teachers, artists, people who spoke openly about healing and boundaries like they were ordinary subjects. At first, their openness startled me. I wasn't used to conversations where vulnerability wasn't a weakness. But slowly, I began to join in. One Saturday, Clara signed us up for a pottery class by the beach. "You need something that isn't work or therapy," she said. I laughed, but I went. The studio smelled of clay and sea salt, the windows open to the sound of waves. When I first touched the cool, damp clay, I felt awkward, unskilled. My hands trembled, too used to precision and control. But the instructor, a woman with gray-streaked hair and paint-speckled clothes, stood beside me and said, "Don't fight it. Let it tell you what it wants to be." Something about that sentence broke me open. For years, I had forced myself into shapes that fit everyone else's expectations. That day, I let the clay collapse, reshape, rise again under my palms. By the end of class, I had formed a small, uneven bowl. It wasn't beautiful, but it was mine. Imperfect, honest, unpolished, like starting over. After class, I walked along the beach. The Pacific stretched endlessly ahead, gray-blue and alive. I took off my shoes and stood where the water met the sand. The waves lapped around my ankles, cool and grounding. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was performing survival. I was living. It was during those first few months that I met Daniel. He was a landscape designer whose firm collaborated with ours on a restoration project near La Jolla. We met over blueprints and soil samples, discussing irrigation systems and sustainability. He had a calm confidence about him, the kind that comes from someone who listens more than he speaks. He noticed details most people missed: the curve of a railing, the way light filtered through leaves. One afternoon, while reviewing plans, he said, "You design buildings that stand through storms. I design spaces that grow after them. Seems we'd get along." It was a simple line, but it stayed with me. We began having coffee after work, long conversations that drifted from design to life, from childhood dreams to the ways people rebuild after breaking. Daniel never asked about my past, and I never volunteered it. Somehow, he knew that some stories are meant to be earned, not extracted. In therapy, Mara reminded me to be cautious. You're learning to accept care without surrendering yourself. That's new territory. Move slowly. I did. For once, there was no rush to define, no desperation to prove worth. Being with Daniel felt like walking beside someone, not chasing them. By the end of my third month in San Diego, I realized something remarkable. I hadn't once checked my phone hoping for a message from my parents. The silence that once terrified me now felt peaceful. Space had become safety. Every morning, I woke to sunlight spilling across my floor and the sound of the city waking up. A bus braking, birds calling, the faint murmur of life continuing. Each day, I chose myself again. Sometimes I still caught my reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. Tired, yes, but no longer small. I wasn't the girl who waited for approval that never came. I was the woman who left at 2 a.m. and built something from the wreckage. A life that finally felt like home. The ivory envelope arrived on a Friday morning, its weight far heavier than paper should ever feel. My name, Emily Carter, was written in elegant cursive, the kind used for announcements that pretend to be joyous but carry something else beneath. Inside was an invitation. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Hannah Grace Thompson and Benjamin Keller, Napa Valley, California. I stared at it for a long time. My cousin Hannah, the family darling, much like Sophie, only younger, softer, still untarnished by the weight of disillusionment. For a few days, I let the invitation sit untouched on my kitchen counter. Then came the phone calls. First from Mom, her voice dripping with practiced gentleness. "It would mean the world if you came, Em. The whole family will be there." Then Dad's follow-up, clipped and authoritative. "It's time to stop holding grudges. Family forgives." And finally, Sophie, her voice oddly careful. "Please, Em, don't make this harder than it has to be." Each call felt like a rope tugging at an old wound. In therapy, I told Dr. Evans about the invitation. "Part of me wants to go," I admitted. "Not for them, just to see if I can exist in that space without disappearing again." She leaned back in her chair, eyes thoughtful. "Then go," she said, "but on your own terms. Boundaries aren't walls, they're doors you control the key to." So I did what I never would have done before. I booked my own hotel, 4 blocks from the Vineyard venue, and bought a dress that felt like armor, deep navy silk, elegant but unapologetic. I planned my own transportation, my own schedule, my own exit strategy if it came to that. I wasn't returning to beg for belonging. I was returning to prove to myself that I no longer needed it. When the day came, Napa was bathed in golden light, the kind that makes even heartbreak look cinematic. The vineyard sprawled across gentle hills, rows of vines heavy with fruit. The rehearsal dinner was held in a restored barn draped with fairy lights and polished wood tables set with wine glasses that sparkled like promise. I paused outside for a moment, watching through the open doors. Laughter drifted out, familiar and foreign all at once. Inside, the noise softened when I entered. Heads turned, conversation stilled just long enough for the weight of my absence and my return to settle over the room. My mother was the first to move. Her face lifted into a smile that trembled at the edges. "Emily," she said, voice bright and strained, "you came." She reached for me, but I stepped lightly aside, keeping space between us. "I said I would," I replied evenly. "I'm happy for Hannah." My father stood a few feet behind her, older than I remembered, his posture slightly collapsed. "It's been a long time," he said. 7 months, I corrected. "Not that long." He looked like he wanted to argue but didn't know how. Sophie hovered nearby, her dress expensive but her eyes tired. "You look incredible," she said, attempting warmth. "California suits you." Her smile faltered before she added, "The BMW got repossessed, by the way." There it was, the admission, quiet and human. I met her eyes and said, "I'm sorry, Soph. That must have been hard." For once, she didn't roll her eyes or deflect. She just nodded, her voice low. "Yeah, it was." Throughout the evening, people approached in cautious waves. Cousins who once ignored me now greeted me with hesitant affection. Aunt Martha whispered that Mom hadn't been herself lately, that Dad had lost his job 3 months ago. "They don't talk about it," she said. "You know how pride runs in this family." Dinner was served, and conversation resumed its rhythm, but the air still crackled with unspoken things. When Dad finally approached my table, bourbon heavy in his glass, he leaned close enough that I could smell the old mix of cologne and disappointment. "Family sticks together," he said, the words landing like an order, not a sentiment. I looked at him, steady and calm. "Does it?" I asked softly. "Or do some of us just keep holding everything together while the rest take it for granted?" His jaw tightened. "We've always supported you." $2 in a piggy bank, I said, not unkindly, but truthfully. "That's what you called support." He didn't answer. His eyes shifted toward the floor, and for the first time I saw not the towering figure of my father, but a man built on his own fragility. Later that night, they asked me to join them in the small wine library attached to the barn. It was quieter there, the walls lined with dark bottles and old family photos. My mother sat straight-backed in a chair, tissues already clutched in her hand. My father paced near the fireplace. Sophie leaned against the window, silent, her reflection flickering against the glass. "We need to talk as a family," Mom began. "I'm listening," I said, remaining standing. Dad stopped pacing. "We're selling the house," he said abruptly. "Things haven't been stable since I was laid off." Mom dabbed her eyes. "And I've been seeing a therapist. Depression, they say. It started after you left, Em." The guilt was a familiar ache, automatic. But I caught it before it took root. I inhaled slowly and said, "I'm sorry you're struggling. I really am. But your choices, your emotions, they're not my responsibility anymore." Mom flinched like I'd struck her. "How can you say that? We're your parents." I stepped closer to the table and placed a small glass jar in front of them. Inside were dozens of crisp $2 bills, neatly folded. "One for every week since I left," I said. "A reminder that I've been rebuilding my worth, one choice at a time." Dad stared at it, incredulous. "What is this supposed to prove? That you can't assign value to love and call it generosity?" The silence that followed was deep and electric. Sophie looked between us, tears forming in her eyes. "I never realized how much it hurt you," she said quietly. "I just thought you didn't need anything." I turned to her, my voice soft. "That's what they taught all of us. That love has to be earned, but it doesn't, not anymore." For the first time, Mom's tears seemed real, not performative. "What do you want from us?" she whispered. "I don't want apologies," I said. "I want change, family therapy, boundaries respected. If those things happen, maybe we can start again, but only then." Dad opened his mouth to protest, but Mom touched his arm. "We'll do it," she said, voice breaking. "If that's what it takes." I nodded once, gathered the jar, and turned toward the door. "Keep it," I said over my shoulder. As a reminder of what happens when you measure one child's worth in dollars and the other's in devotion. Outside, the air was cool and fragrant with roses. The moon hung low over the vineyard, the vines silvered in its light. Somewhere inside, laughter echoed again as if nothing had changed. But something had. As I walked back toward the lights of the main hall, Sophie followed me onto the terrace. "I don't know how to do this," she said, her voice trembling. "Standing on my own. I never had to before." I placed a hand on her arm. "You'll learn," I said gently. "It's hard, but it's the only way we stop repeating their mistakes." She nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I'm sorry, Em." "I know," I said. "Me too." When I returned to the hotel that night, I sat by the window, watching the vineyard fade into shadow. The glass jar, now half empty, sat on the table beside me. I thought about Dr. Evans' words, how healing isn't about rewriting the past, but reclaiming the narrative. That night, I finally believed it. I wasn't the daughter begging for acknowledgement anymore. I was the woman who had faced the storm, told the truth, and walked out standing tall. 1 year after that night in Denver, The air in San Diego smelled of salt, rosemary, and warmth. The kind of Christmas that didn't need snow to feel real. The city shimmered under soft December sunlight, and for the first time in my adult life, the holiday didn't feel like a test of endurance. It felt like peace. My apartment had transformed since the day I moved in. The walls once bare now held photographs from hikes, pottery I'd made by hand, and sketches of buildings that had become blueprints, then structures. The futon had been replaced with a soft cream sofa, and the bookshelf, once sparse, overflowed with novels and ceramic bowls. It wasn't luxury, but it was mine. Everything in it had been chosen, not inherited. That morning, I woke to the sound of gulls outside the window and the smell of coffee already brewing. Daniel stood in the kitchen, humming quietly as he arranged herbs beside the roast he'd been preparing since dawn. "You don't have to cook everything," I said, smiling as I tied my robe. He glanced back, amused. "You built a life from scratch, Emily. The least I can do is make lunch." The way he said it, simply, without grandeur, still caught me off guard sometimes. After years of loving people who measured affection in sacrifice, I still wasn't used to love that asked for nothing. I set the table while soft jazz filled the apartment. Sunlight streamed through the window, painting golden patches across the wood floor. Clara arrived first, carrying a pie and a bottle of wine, her curls whipped wild by the wind. Behind her came 2 friends from my pottery class, arms full of dishes, and then Daniel's sister with her kids. It was a full, joyful chaos that would have terrified me a year ago. Now, it just felt right. We gathered around the table, laughter rising and overlapping, stories spilling into one another. At one point, Clara raised her glass. "To Emily," she said, "who proves that starting over isn't about running away, it's about coming home to yourself." My cheeks warmed as the group echoed the toast. Daniel reached for my hand under the table, his thumb tracing slow circles over my knuckles. The simplicity of the moment, warm food, kind faces, no undercurrent of performance, felt like grace. After dinner, as the others drifted to the balcony with coffee, I walked to the shelf above the fireplace. The piggy bank sat there, the same one from that Christmas morning, but now filled with crisp $2 bills, each one marking another week of freedom, of growth. I turned it in my hands, smiling at how the object that once symbolized humiliation now stood for reclamation. Beside it sat another gift, one that had arrived 2 days earlier, wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside had been my childhood dollhouse, freshly painted, every missing shingle repaired, every window polished. A note in my mother's handwriting rested inside. "It always belonged to you." When I read it, I didn't cry. Instead, I felt a quiet recognition. People can change, but slowly, imperfectly, the way pottery cracks in the kiln before finding its true strength. We were all still forming, still firing under heat, and that was okay. The phone on the counter buzzed. A video call from Sophie. Our relationship was cautious but honest now, a fragile truce built on small truths. I answered, and her face appeared, smiling but tired. Behind her was a modest apartment, walls painted soft yellow. "Merry Christmas, Em," she said. "Merry Christmas," I replied. "How are you holding up?" She laughed lightly. "Working 2 jobs, so surviving. I started teaching art at the community college. My students are better painters than I ever was." "That sounds like something you'd be great at," I said. She tilted her head, her voice softening. "You look happy. I don't think I've ever seen you like this." "I am," I admitted. "For the first time, I really am." Sophie hesitated, then said, "Mom wanted me to tell you that Dad's 90 days sober today. He's been going to meetings, and she's volunteering now at the community pantry. They talk about you a lot. Not the way they used to. It's different now." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Healing wasn't linear. I wasn't sure yet if I was ready to step back into their orbit, but knowing they were trying, that mattered. Before we hung up, Sophie held something up to the camera, a small clay ornament shaped like a heart. "I made this in class," she said, smiling shyly. "It's not great, but I wanted you to have it." "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it. After the call, I stood at the window, watching the waves crash against the shore beyond the city skyline. The day was fading into dusk, the horizon tinged with lavender and gold. Behind me, the people I loved laughed over dessert, their voices soft and full. I thought about the girl I'd been a year ago, the one who'd driven through snow at 2 in the morning, terrified and certain in equal measure. She had no idea what waited on the other side of courage. Daniel came to stand beside me, slipping an arm around my shoulders. "Deep thoughts?" he asked. "Just gratitude," I said. "For all of it. Even the hard parts. They taught me how to build this." He kissed my temple. "You built something solid, Emily. You always do." Later, when everyone had gone and the apartment had quieted, I walked to the balcony. The night air was cool, the city glittering below. I could hear faint carols drifting from somewhere down the street, mingling with the sound of the sea. I leaned against the railing, feeling the stillness settle over me. The life I had now wasn't perfect, but it was authentic. There were no red bows, no performances, no measuring of worth, just truth and peace and the slow rhythm of healing. Inside, the piggy bank gleamed faintly in the light from the tree, a reminder of how far I'd come. I thought about my parents, how they were learning, perhaps for the first time, that love isn't control, about Sophie, finding her footing, about myself, no longer trying to earn a place at anyone's table because I'd built my own. When I finally went to bed that night, the ocean breeze carried through the open window, cool and steady. I closed my eyes, knowing that Christmas could mean something different now. Not obligation, not pain, but belonging. Belonging to myself, to the people who saw me, to the life I'd chosen. It took 38 years and $2 to learn it, but that was the miracle of it all. Some gifts don't come wrapped in bows. Some you give yourself quietly at 2 a.m. when you finally decide to start again. The night had settled softly over San Diego, the air carrying a quiet chill that smelled faintly of ocean and citrus. Through the open window of my apartment, I could hear the muted hum of the city, the distant roll of waves, laughter from a nearby rooftop, the occasional car passing on the street below. The day's warmth lingered in the wooden floors, and the lights from the Christmas tree glowed in soft reflections across the glass. The last of the dishes were stacked neatly in the sink, traces of cinnamon and roasted herbs still clinging to the air. It was late, but I wasn't tired. I sat by the window with a cup of tea in hand, wrapped in the blanket Daniel had draped over my shoulders earlier. This Christmas was nothing like the ones I grew up with. And that was the point. There were no glittering performances, no silent competitions, no exhaustion masquerading as love. Just quiet, real laughter, connection. I looked around my apartment, the pottery lining the shelves, the family of friends whose fingerprints lingered on the table from dinner, the faint scent of pine. A life built with intention, not approval. Daniel joined me on the couch, carrying 2 mugs of hot cocoa. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. His hair was tousled, his voice low, the kind of tone that invited honesty. I shook my head. "Just thinking." He smiled. "That can be dangerous for an architect." I laughed softly. "Maybe, but I've spent most of my life overbuilding things. Plans, expectations, defenses. It's nice to sit inside something that doesn't need reinforcement." He handed me the mug. "You've built something solid, Emily. Not just this place. Yourself." For a long moment, I said nothing. I thought of how true that was and how hard it had been to get here. Healing hadn't been cinematic. It had been raw, unglamorous, slow. There were nights when the silence in this apartment felt too large, when I missed the noise of dysfunction simply because it was familiar. There were mornings when guilt still tugged at me like gravity, whispering that I had abandoned rather than saved my family. But the truth was clearer now. I had saved the only person I was ever responsible for saving, myself. On the mantel, the piggy bank caught my eye again, its soft pink surface gleaming in the light. It no longer looked small. It looked symbolic, a reminder that worth could not be assigned by anyone else's scale. Inside it were those crisp $2 bills, one for each week since the night I drove away from Denver. Not tokens of resentment, but of reclamation. Each one marked a choice, to stay gone, to heal, to define my own value. Daniel followed my gaze. "I used to think that was just decoration," he said. "Now I get it." I smiled faintly. "It's my reminder of who I was and who I don't have to be again." He reached over, brushing his fingers against mine. "You know, some people spend their whole lives trying to earn love from people who don't know how to give it. You stop trying. That takes a kind of courage I don't think most people ever find." His words landed deep. For years, I'd mistaken endurance for bravery, silence for strength. It took leaving everything behind to learn that true courage wasn't about surviving pain. It was about choosing joy afterward. The phone buzzed beside me. A message from Sophie. Got the ornament? I glanced at the small clay heart hanging near the tree, uneven edges, faint fingerprints pressed into the glaze. It wasn't perfect, but it was made with sincerity. I smiled as I typed back. It's beautiful. Thank you. Then another message came through. This one from Mom. Merry Christmas, sweetheart. We're proud of you. Truly. Attached was a photo of my parents standing outside a modest apartment building, Dad holding a cup of coffee, Mom wearing the same red scarf she'd had for decades. They looked older, smaller somehow, but softer too. There was no red bow this year, no performance, just two people learning, slowly, how to be human again. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I let the moment wash over me. The part of me that still wanted to fix everything softened. They were on their journey. I was on mine. Maybe someday our paths would align again. Maybe they wouldn't. But either way, I no longer needed their validation to feel whole. I turned to Daniel and said quietly, "It's strange, isn't it? How you can spend a lifetime chasing something and the moment you stop, it finally finds you." He tilted his head. "Love? Peace," I said. "The kind that doesn't demand proof." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights flicker across the bay. The world outside felt endless, yet for the first time, I felt entirely grounded within it. When Daniel went to bed, I stayed by the window, writing in the leather journal I'd bought back in Sedona, the one that began with "I'm not lost. I'm unlearning." Tonight, I filled the last page. I wrote about the house key I left on my parents' counter, about the drive-through snow, about the diner where Ruth handed me pie and wisdom, about the therapy sessions that taught me how to name things I'd once buried under competence. I wrote about Clara, who opened her home without hesitation, about pottery that cracked but didn't break, about the woman who walked into her family's reckoning and didn't flinch. And I wrote about this new kind of family, the one built on mutual respect instead of obligation. The friends who checked in not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The man who saw me as someone to walk beside, not someone to fix. The self I'd finally come home to. When I put the pen down, the city had grown quiet. I stood and walked to the balcony, wrapping the blanket tighter around my shoulders. Below, the Pacific stretched out in endless dark, the reflection of the moon dancing across its surface. I remembered what Dr. Evans once told me. Healing isn't a destination, Emily. It's architecture. You build it beam by beam. I whispered the words into the wind, almost like a prayer. Worth isn't something you earn. It's something you claim by knowing what you will and won't accept. Behind me, through the window, the soft pink piggy bank gleamed beside the dollhouse my mother had sent. The past and present side by side, one representing what I survived, the other what I reclaimed. I breathed in the salt air and let it fill me, steady and deep. I thought of that girl on the floor in Denver, clutching $2 crumpled dollars, and I wanted to tell her everything. To tell her that someday she'd build a home filled with laughter, that love would come quietly but fully, that she'd never need to beg for belonging again. Instead, I whispered to her memory, "You made it." The city stretched before me, alive with lights and sound and life, and I finally understood what freedom truly felt like. It wasn't the absence of family or the silence of escape. It was this, standing alone but not lonely, surrounded by love freely chosen, and finally knowing without doubt that I was enough. Emily Carter's story is one of breaking cycles and reclaiming self-worth after a lifetime of conditional love. For 38 years, she was the responsible daughter, the quiet achiever who never asked for much because she was taught that needing less made her more lovable. But one snowy Christmas night in Denver shattered that illusion. A $2 home fund gift beside her sister's brand new BMW revealed what had always been true. She was loved for her usefulness, not for herself. Leaving at 2 a.m. wasn't rebellion. It was liberation. Her journey through Arizona, her rebuilding in San Diego, and her eventual return to face her family at the Napa wedding marked the evolution of a woman who learned to choose peace over approval. With the help of friends, therapy, and her own resilience, Emily learned that boundaries aren't barriers, they're bridges toward freedom. She turned pain into purpose, filling that same piggy bank, once symbolizing humiliation with $2 bills representing every week of self-respect earned. By the time she built her new life, she no longer chased validation. She lived her truth. The deeper lesson here is this: family doesn't always mean safety, and love isn't proven by endurance. True belonging begins when you stop negotiating your worth. We all have the power to walk away from what diminishes us and to build lives defined by respect, not obligation. In a world that glorifies self-sacrifice, Emily's story reminds us that peace is not selfish, it's sacred. Question: if you were Emily, what would you have done after that Christmas morning? A. Stay and try to fix the family dynamic. B. Leave to rebuild your own peace, even if it means walking away alone. Comment your answer A or B below and share why. What's your take on Emily's story? Would you have had the courage to leave or chosen forgiveness first? Share your thoughts so others can learn from your perspective. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support more powerful healing stories like this one.